On a cloudy morning in Atlanta, an elderly woman named Mrs. Brooks walked slowly into a downtown bank. She was in her 70s, dressed neatly in her Sunday best, leaning carefully on her cane. Her face carried the softness of wisdom. But her eyes revealed something else, a quiet determination. She wasn't there to ask for help. She wasn't begging for sympathy. She was simply there to cash a check, the same way she had done for decades. But the world has a way of forgetting people like her. In the busy lobby, younger customers were served quickly, while Mrs. Brooks was made to wait. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. When her turn finally came, instead of kindness, she was met with suspicion. The teller frowned at her check, questioned its authenticity, and treated her as if she were a criminal rather than a customer. People behind her sighed impatiently, some whispering, others rolling their eyes. For Mrs. Brooks, it wasn't just about the check. It was about dignity. She had worked her whole life, teaching children, raising a family, paying her bills on time. And now, in her twilight years, she was standing in front of strangers who saw only her age and skin color, not the human being behind them. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain herself. But the humiliation was already cutting deep. That's when the atmosphere of the bank shifted. A tall figure stepped forward from the line, his presence impossible to ignore. It was Vin Diesel. Most people knew him as the action star from blockbuster films, the tough guy with a gravelly voice. But here, in that quiet bank lobby, there were no cameras, no scripts, and no spotlight. Just a man who could not stay silent while an elderly woman was disrespected. He spoke firmly, not as a celebrity, but as a human being who had seen enough. His voice filled the room, and suddenly every eye turned toward him. The whispers stopped, the sighs faded, and for the first time that morning, Mrs. Brooks didn't feel completely invisible. The tension in the bank became heavy, but what happened next would prove unforgettable, because this wasn't just about one woman cashing a check. It was about every elderly person who had ever been ignored, every customer who had ever been mistreated, every voice that had ever been silenced. And it was about one unexpected hero who refused to let it happen on his watch. As the rain began to fall outside, the bank became the stage for a moment that would soon travel far beyond those walls, a moment that would remind the world what true respect looks like. If you think this moment is powerful, wait until you see what happened next. Vin Diesel didn't just speak up. What followed shocked everyone in that bank. The check was finally in Mrs. Brooks's hands. After all the waiting, after all the embarrassment, she held it like it was more than just a piece of paper. It felt like proof that she had been heard, that she had not been erased. But the sting of what had happened lingered, like a shadow she couldn't shake off. The manager had apologized repeatedly, and the staff had tried to smooth things over once they realized who had stepped in to defend her. Yet the wound of disrespect is never healed by a quick sorry. Vin Diesel had walked beside her to the doors of the bank. He didn't make a big show of it. He didn't pose for photos, didn't flash a Hollywood smile, didn't act like a superstar. He simply stood there as a shield, as a quiet presence, making sure that Mrs. Brooks felt safe, enough to walk out with her head held a little higher than when she walked in. And as she stepped into the rain, her cane clicking against the sidewalk, something began to unfold that neither of them could have imagined. Inside that bank, a young woman had lifted her phone and recorded part of the scene. She hadn't planned it, hadn't thought about the consequences, but by instinct she captured the moment a global movie star stood up for a grandmother who had been humiliated in public. By the time Mrs. Brooks reached the bus stop a block away, that video was already bouncing from one social media feed to another. The world, so quick to scroll past, stopped for a moment to watch, and in that pause, hearts shifted. On the bus, Mrs. Brooks sat quietly, her purse clutched tight to her chest. The window beside her blurred with streaks of rain, and the hum of the engine was the only sound filling the silence. She thought of her late husband, Charles, who had passed a decade earlier. He had always been the one to handle the banking, the bills, the errands. Since his passing, she had learned to do it all alone. She had built herself into a woman of resilience, a woman who could carry her own weight even when her body was slowing down. Yet today, as she replayed the scene in her mind, she felt small. The whispers behind her in line, the judgment in the teller's eyes. It all weighed on her shoulders. But then she remembered Vin's presence, The way he had spoken, the way his words had shifted the entire room. For just a few moments, she had not been invisible. She had mattered. Meanwhile, Vin was in his car, riding quietly through the same storm. His assistant had rushed over after realizing what had happened, urging him to release a statement before the video went viral. But Vin shook his head. This wasn't about press or headlines. It wasn't about protecting his image. It was about her, the elderly woman with trembling hands and a lifetime of unspoken battles. He told his assistant not to worry about statements, but to make sure Mrs. Brooks got home safely. That mattered more than any article or social post ever could. Back at her modest apartment, Mrs. Brooks turned on a single lamp in the living room. Family photographs covered her walls. Her children, her students, her late husband smiling from a frame. The day had drained her, but just as she was about to sit down and rest, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, her breath caught. Vin Diesel stood there holding a small paper bag of groceries. He didn't come with reporters or cameras, just a simple smile and a quiet respect. Inside the bag was bread, milk, some fresh vegetables, and tucked between them a bouquet of flowers. Mrs. Brooks's eyes filled with tears. For years, she had walked into grocery stores and felt ignored. For years, she had stood in lines and been overlooked. And now, here was a man the whole world recognized, standing on her porch with kindness in his hands. That evening, the two of them sat at her kitchen table. She poured him tea, and for a while, they simply shared the silence of two people from very different worlds who somehow understood each other perfectly. Vin told her that when he was young, he had a teacher who believed in him when no one else did. She had once told him that respect wasn't something earned with fame. It was something given freely to every human being. And that lesson had stayed with him his whole life. He told Mrs. Brooks that in the bank that morning, he had heard that teacher's voice again. That's why he had stepped forward. Mrs. Brooks listened, wiping her tears, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like just another forgotten face in the crowd. She felt seen. She felt valued. Meanwhile, the video of the confrontation was exploding across the internet. By midnight, millions of people had watched it. Hashtags were trending worldwide to respect the elderly. Vin Diesel hero, Mrs. Brooks. News outlets called it a reminder of the power of decency. In an age where kindness was often overlooked, the bank was flooded with angry calls, and customers threatened to close their accounts. But for Mrs. Brooks, the most powerful part of that day wasn't the millions of strangers watching her story. It wasn't even the apology calls the bank began making the very next morning. The most powerful part was the knock on her door, the groceries on her counter, and the flowers on her table. It was the reminder that dignity could be restored, not by corporate statements, but by genuine human care. The next morning, when she turned on the television, she saw herself on the news. Former students she hadn't spoken to in decades began calling her phone, saying they had seen her, that they remembered her lessons, that she had made an impact on their lives long ago. For a woman who had spent years feeling invisible, the sudden flood of recognition was overwhelming. But even as the world was swept up in the viral story, Vin remained quiet. He avoided interviews, avoided comment, because to him, this was never about publicity. It was about one elderly woman who deserved more than she was given. It was about standing up at the right moment, even when it was easier to stay silent. And as the rain cleared over the city, a truth settled into the hearts of those who had watched. Sometimes it only takes one act of courage, one voice raised at the right moment, to remind the world what respect really looks like. Wait until you hear how this story truly ends. What happened to Mrs. Brooks after the world discovered her story? Did her life change forever, or did things go back to the way they were? In the days that followed, the world couldn't stop talking about Mrs. Brooks. What had started as a humiliating morning at the bank had become a movement that spread across screens and headlines everywhere. People who had never met her felt connected to her pain and inspired by the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. For Mrs. Brooks, the sudden attention was overwhelming. Reporters gathered outside her building. Cameras followed her to the grocery store. And strangers stopped her on the street just to say, "We saw you. We believe in you. You reminded us of respect." She wasn't used to this kind of spotlight, but deep down, she understood that it wasn't really about her. It was about what she represented. Vin Diesel had gone back to filming. back to his schedule, but he hadn't forgotten her. Away from the cameras, he checked in on her quietly, making sure she had everything she needed. To him, she wasn't a viral story. She was a woman who had lived through decades of struggles and still carried herself with grace. One evening, Mrs. Brooks sat by her window as the sun set over Atlanta. The city lights began to glow, and she thought about everything that had happened. For so long, she had felt invisible, another elderly face that people looked past. But now, she realized something important. Respect was not a gift to be begged for. It was a right that everyone deserved, and by standing her ground, even in silence, she had reminded the world of that truth. Soon after, an invitation arrived in her mailbox. It wasn't from the bank, and it wasn't from the press. It was from Vin Diesel himself. He had arranged for Mrs. Brooks to attend the premiere of his next movie, not as a fan in the crowd, but as his guest of honor. The night of the event, she arrived in a simple but elegant dress, escorted down the red carpet as photographers called her name. For once, the flashing cameras weren't chasing a celebrity, they were celebrating her. And as she walked alongside Vin Diesel, hand in hand, the crowd erupted in applause. Not because she was famous, not because she was wealthy, but because she symbolized something greater. The reminder that no matter how old, no matter what color, no matter how fragile someone may appear, every person deserves respect. That night, as the movie lights dimmed and the audience went quiet, Mrs. Brooks felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt seen. She felt valued. And she realized that what had begun as one of the most painful days of her life had turned into one of the most meaningful. In the weeks that followed, her story inspired change. Banks across the country began holding training sessions on how to treat elderly customers with dignity. Community groups reached out to their senior citizens, checking on their needs, making sure no one felt invisible. Schools even shared her story with students, teaching them that respect isn't about titles or money, it's about humanity. And Mrs. Brooks herself? She continued living in her modest apartment, continued cooking her simple meals, continued walking to church on Sundays with her cane. But something inside her had changed forever. She no longer felt invisible. She knew her worth. She knew that the world had finally seen her, and through her, had been reminded of something it had almost forgotten. As for Vin Diesel, he returned to his films, his interviews, his global fame. But every so often, when people asked him about his greatest role, he didn't mention the blockbusters, the action scenes, or the awards. Instead, he spoke about a rainy morning in Atlanta, a grandmother with tired hands, and the simple act of standing up when it mattered most. Because sometimes the greatest stories aren't written on movie sets. They happen in real life, in everyday places, when ordinary people are reminded of their extraordinary value. And so what began as a humiliation in a bank lobby became a story that touched millions of hearts. A story of respect, dignity, and humanity. A story that proved heroes don't always wear capes. They sometimes just carry groceries, open doors, or sit quietly beside someone who needs to know they matter. Mrs. Brooks may have walked into the bank feeling small and overlooked, but she walked out with something far greater than a cashed check. She walked out with her dignity restored, her story heard, and her place in history secured, not as a victim of humiliation, but as a symbol of hope. If this story touched your heart, don't let it stop here. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness and respect still exist. And if you believe in standing up for others, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more stories that inspire and remind us what truly matters.